Someone left footprints in the snow. I woke up at 2:37 a.m. because I heard someone breathing outside my bedroom window. Not wind. Not an animal. Slow, steady breathing. Close enough that the glass fogged slightly when they exhaled. When I finally looked outside, I didn't see a person, just a single set of footprints in the snow, leading straight to the window. And stopping there, there were no tracks going back into the woods. And whatever stood there knew exactly which room I was sleeping in. I've gone back and forth for years about whether I should ever write this down. Part of me feels like saying it out loud. Somehow gives it more power, like acknowledging it makes it real again. But every Christmas, when the air gets sharp and quiet and the nights stretch longer than they should, I find myself replaying it anyway. So I'm writing it now exactly as I remember it, because I still don't have an explanation. And maybe I never will. This happened 3 years ago, a few days before Christmas, when I was 26. At the time, I was working remotely as a graphic designer, which meant I could technically work from anywhere with a decent internet connection. My parents had moved out of state, my lease had just ended, and when my aunt offered to let me stay at her cabin in northern Pennsylvania for a few weeks over the holidays, it felt like perfect timing. The cabin had belonged to my late uncle. It was tucked deep in the woods, about 40 minutes from the nearest town, and it had been empty since the previous winter. My aunt warned me it would be quiet, very quiet, but that was exactly what I wanted. I arrived on December 21st, just before sunset. The sky was already turning that dull winter gray, and snow had started falling lightly. The kind that doesn't seem like much until you realize it's coating everything in silence. The driveway was a narrow, winding strip cut through tall pines, and by the time I parked, the world felt completely sealed off. No traffic noise, no distant lights. Just the cabin, the trees, and the steady hush of snow. Inside, the cabin was cold but intact. The air smelled faintly of old wood dust and something metallic, like iron. I turned on the heat, unpacked a few things, and FaceTimed my aunt to let her know I'd arrived safely. She joked about me becoming a Christmas hermit and reminded me that the nearest neighbor was over 2 miles away. At the time, that didn't bother me. It actually felt comforting. That first night passed without incident. I slept heavily, worn out from the drive, and woke up to a pale, overcast morning. Snow had piled up overnight, at least 6 inches. The cabin looked like it had been dropped into a postcard: white ground, dark trees, gray sky. I spent the day working, listening to soft instrumental Christmas music, occasionally glancing out the windows. Everything was still. The second night was when things started to feel off. Around 10:30 p.m., I noticed the power flicker. Just once, the lights dimmed and then returned to normal. I remember checking my phone immediately, half expecting a notification from the power company, but there was nothing. I brushed it off. Rural area, old lines, winter weather. It made sense. By midnight, the snow had started falling again, heavier this time. I was sitting on the couch with a blanket, scrolling mindlessly, when I heard what sounded like a dull thump from outside. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct enough that I muted my phone. I sat there, holding my breath, listening. Nothing. After a minute, I laughed quietly at myself. Snow sliding off the roof, I figured, or a branch giving way. Still, I got up and checked the front door, making sure it was locked. It was. The windows, too. I went to bed shortly after that. I woke up at exactly 2:37 a.m. I know the time because I checked my phone immediately, my heart already racing for reasons I couldn't explain. The cabin was completely silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like it's pressing against your ears. The air in the room felt colder than before, and I could see my breath faintly in the dim light from the digital clock. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. They were outside, slow and deliberate, crunching through snow. Not circling the cabin, not wandering aimlessly, moving straight across the ground, step by step. I lay there frozen, staring at the ceiling, listening. Each footstep sounded heavy, as if whoever or whatever was out there had no concern about being quiet. I told myself it was an animal, a deer, maybe. But the rhythm was wrong, too even, too measured. The footsteps stopped near the front of the cabin. I waited for a knock, or a voice, or something. Instead, there was just breathing. It was faint, almost lost in the sound of the wind brushing against the trees. But once I noticed it, I couldn't unhear it. Slow, controlled breaths right outside the front door. I sat up in bed, my hands shaking so badly I had to clench them together. My first instinct was to call someone, anyone. But the idea of the sound of my own voice breaking the silence terrified me even more. After what felt like several minutes, the breathing stopped. Then the footsteps moved again, this time toward the side of the cabin, toward the window of the living room. I slipped out of bed and crept to the bedroom door, moving as quietly as I could. The floorboards groaned softly under my weight, and I froze every time, waiting for some kind of response. There was none. From the hallway, I could see the faint glow of moonlight through the living room window. I edged closer, staying against the wall, my heart pounding so hard I was sure it would give me away. The footsteps stopped again, right outside the window. I stood there, my back pressed against the wall, staring at the dark rectangle of glass. I wanted to look, but fear rooted me in place. My mind raced through every possible scenario, none of them good. A lost hiker, a drunk, someone who knew the cabin was usually empty, or someone who didn't want to be seen. Then came the sound of fingernails against glass. It was soft at first, like someone testing the surface. A slow scrape, moving horizontally. I covered my mouth to keep from making any noise, tears burning in my eyes. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to break in. They were touching the window, exploring it. I finally forced myself to look. The curtain was slightly parted, just enough for me to see a shape on the other side. A silhouette, tall and close, blocking out the faint light. I couldn't see a face, just a vague outline of a head and shoulders. The hand moved again, fingers splayed, pressing flat against the glass. I whispered, barely audible, "Who's there?" The scraping stopped instantly. For a moment, there was nothing. Then the hand slowly slid down the glass, leaving faint streaks where condensation met skin. And then the silhouette leaned closer. I still don't know why I did what I did next. Maybe some part of my brain snapped under the pressure. I flipped on the living room light. The window was empty. No person, no movement, just my own terrified reflection staring back at me. I stood there for a long time, shaking, listening for any sound. There was nothing. Eventually, I locked myself in the bedroom, dragged a dresser in front of the door, and stayed awake until morning. When daylight finally came, the world looked normal again. Quiet, peaceful, almost mocking. I stepped outside around 8:15 a.m., bundled up, my breath fogging in the cold air. That's when I saw the footprints. They came from the tree line, a single set, deep and clear in the fresh snow. Heavy boots, size maybe 11 or 12. Heavy boots, size maybe 11 or 12. They led straight to the front of the cabin. Then they circled to the living room window. And then they stopped. No footprints leading away. No disturbance in the snow beyond that point. Just an abrupt end, as if whoever made them had vanished into thin air. I packed my things within the hour and drove back to town, not stopping until I reached. At a motel with lights and people and noise, I told myself there had to be an explanation. Someone messing with me. Tracks covered by drifting snow. But every year since then, around Christmas, I dream about that night. About waking up at 2:37 a.m., about hearing footsteps in the snow. And sometimes, when I wake up from those dreams, I swear I can hear slow, steady breathing right outside my window, waiting for me to turn on the light again. The caroler who wouldn't leave. I've never told this story out loud without feeling my throat tighten halfway through. Even now, writing it, my hands keep pausing over the keyboard, like they don't want to remember what comes next. I still live with the consequences of that Christmas, not in any dramatic way that people would notice, but in small habits, double-checking locks, never answering doors after dark, and turning off any Christmas music the moment it starts to sound, even slightly distorted. This happened when I was 22. During my final year of college, I was staying alone in a small rental house, just off campus in a quiet Midwestern town. Most of my roommates had already gone home for winter break, and I couldn't afford the plane ticket back to my parents' place until after Christmas. I told myself it would be fine, peaceful even. I'd work extra shifts at my part-time job, binge movies, and enjoy the silence. The house was old, built sometime in the 1940s, with thin walls, creaky floors, and a front porch that groaned whenever the temperature dropped. It sat at the edge of a residential neighborhood, bordered on one side by a stretch of undeveloped land and trees. During the day, it felt harmless. At night, especially in winter, it felt isolated in a way I couldn't quite explain. Christmas Eve fell on a Sunday that year. I got home from work around 8:45 p.m., exhausted and a little homesick. Snow had been falling steadily since afternoon, coating the streets in slush and muting the usual sounds of traffic. The air smelled like wet pavement and cold metal. I microwaved some leftovers, turned on a small table-taped Christmas tree I'd bought on clearance, and tried to make the house feel less empty. By 10 p.m., the neighborhood was silent. No cars, no voices, just the occasional hiss of wind against the siding. I remember checking the time repeatedly, counting down until midnight, for no real reason, just to mark the passing of the holiday. At around 10:42 p.m., I heard singing. At first, I thought it was coming from my laptop. I pulled out my earbuds, expecting to hear some autoplay carol. But the sound didn't stop. It was faint but unmistakable. Voices, plural, singing softly and slightly out of sync. Silent night, holy night, I froze, standing in the middle of the living room, my heart immediately picking up speed. Christmas carolers weren't unheard of in town, but I'd never seen them come this late, and never during a snowstorm. The singing grew louder, clearer, as if the group was moving closer. I stepped toward the front window and peeked through the blinds. The porch light cast a weak yellow glow onto the snow-covered steps, but beyond that was only darkness. The singing stopped abruptly, cutting off mid-verse. A knock followed. 3 slow knocks. Firm but not aggressive. My first instinct was to ignore it. I stood there barely breathing, waiting to see if they'd move on. Then came a voice, cheerful and oddly flat at the same time. "Carolers," a man said, "just spreading some Christmas cheer." I didn't respond. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure they could hear it. Another knock, this time closer together, more impatient. I finally called out, "Sorry, I'm not interested." There was a brief pause. Then the same voice replied, "We'll just sing one more." Before I could protest, the singing started again. Except this time, something was wrong. The melody was familiar, but the pacing was off. Too slow in places, too fast in others. The voices weren't harmonizing. They were overlapping, clashing slightly, like people who hadn't practiced together. And beneath it all, I heard something else. A faint scraping sound, rhythmic like shoes dragging across wood. They were on the porch. I backed away from the door, every nerve in my body screaming that something wasn't right. I glanced at my phone. No missed calls, no messages. It was 10:51 p.m. The song ended. Silence followed, thick and uncomfortable. Then a different voice spoke. A woman this time, her tone gentle, almost pleading. "We know you're home." My stomach dropped. I hadn't turned on many lights. The house looked dark from the outside. There was no reason for them to be sure. I said I'm not interested, I called out, my voice shaking despite my effort to sound firm. Another pause, then laughter. Quiet, restrained, as if shared between people trying not to be overheard. The man spoke again. That's okay. We don't need to come in. I heard footsteps moving across the porch. The scraping sound returned, louder now. It took me a moment to realize what it was. Something was being dragged. The singing started again. But this time it wasn't a carol I recognized. The words were wrong, fragmented, repeating phrases about cold, about light, about doors being opened. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed the biggest knife I owned, my hands slick with sweat. My mind raced through options. Call the police, hide, run, but fear made everything feel unreal, like I was moving through water. At exactly 11:02 p.m., the singing stopped. Something heavy thudded against the front door. Not a knock, a deliberate impact. I screamed before I could stop myself. The door handle rattled violently, once, twice. Then a voice right on the other side of the door, close enough that I could hear breath. Please, the woman said softly. It's so cold. I didn't answer. I backed into the hallway, my entire body trembling. The house felt impossibly small, every shadow suddenly threatening. There was another thud, harder this time. The door frame creaked. Then, nothing. No voices. No movement. I waited, counting my breaths, listening until my ears rang from the effort. Minutes passed, 10, maybe more. I slowly crept back toward the living room, peering around the corner. The front door was still closed, intact. I approached the window again, pulling the blinds aside, just enough to look. The porch was empty, but something was leaning against the door, a wooden object, tall and narrow. It took me a moment to recognize it. A manger, the kind used in nativity scenes. It was smeared with something dark that soaked into the snow beneath it. I stumbled back, gagging as a metallic smell filled the air. Blood. I was sure of it. My phone buzzed in my hand, making me jump. A text message from an unknown number. Merry Christmas. I didn't stay in that house another minute. Merry Christmas. I grabbed my coat, my keys, and ran out the back door, slipping in the snow as I crossed the yard. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station nearly a mile away, where I collapsed inside, sobbing, and begged the clerk to call the police. They went back with me later that night. The porch was empty. No manger, no blood, no footprints except my own frantic trail through the snow. The police told me it was probably a prank. Doctor, kids, bad timing. But they couldn't explain how the text had been sent from a number that, according to their records, didn't exist. I moved out 2 days later. Every Christmas Eve since then, around 11 p.m., I get a message from an unknown number. It always says the same thing. It's cold. Out here. He kept knocking after midnight. I used to think people exaggerated when they said Christmas felt lonely after a loss. I thought it was just nostalgia talking. That changed the year my father died. Because that was the first Christmas I spent completely alone, and the only Christmas I've ever wished I could erase from my memory. This happened 5 years ago when I was 29. I had just moved to a new city for work, a mid-sized place in the Pacific Northwest where winter comes with constant drizzle, fog, and a kind of cold that seeps into your bones instead of biting at your skin. My dad had passed away unexpectedly in October, and by December, I wasn't in the mood for family gatherings or forced cheer. My mom insisted I come home, but I told her I needed space, that I needed quiet. So I stayed in my apartment. It was a small ground-floor unit in a converted old building, probably from the early 1900s. The walls were thick brick, the ceilings low, and the windows narrow. The place had character, the landlord liked to say, but what it really had was a constant smell of damp wood and something faintly sour, like old water trapped where it shouldn't be. My unit faced the street, but the street itself was quiet. A dead end that only served the building and a few others nearby. Christmas Eve fell on a Tuesday that year. I got off work early, stopped by a grocery store, and picked up a frozen dinner I didn't even end up eating. By the time I got home around 6:30 p.m., the sky was already dark, and a light mist hung in the air, catching the glow of the streetlights and turning everything hazy. I locked the door behind me, double-checked it out of habit, and turned on the small lamp in the living room. I didn't bother with decorations. No tree, no lights, just the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the occasional sound of a car passing somewhere far off. By 9 p.m., I was sitting on the couch with a blanket, scrolling through my phone, half watching some random show. Outside, the mist had thickened into a steady drizzle, tapping softly against the window. It was the kind of night where sound carried strangely, muffled but also sharp in sudden bursts. At around 9:47 p.m., there was a knock at my door. 3 quick knocks. I frowned, glancing at the time. No one I knew lived nearby, and I wasn't expecting anyone. I muted the TV and listened. Silence followed. I got up and looked through the peephole. The hallway outside my door was dimly lit, the yellow light flickering slightly. No one was there. I told myself it was probably someone at the wrong apartment. It happened sometimes. I locked the deadbolt again and went back to the couch. At 10:12 p.m., the knock came again. This time, it was slower, deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. My stomach tightened. I didn't answer right away. I stood a few feet from the door, listening for footsteps, for voices, for anything that would explain it. Nothing. Hello. I finally called out, keeping my voice steady. No response. I checked the peephole again. Empty hallway. That's when I noticed something that made my skin prickle. The air felt colder near the door, like a draft was seeping in even though the weather stripping was new. I could smell something faint, carried in with the cold, wet wool maybe, mixed with something earthy. I locked the chain and stepped back. By 10:30 p.m., I was fully on edge. I texted my mom just a casual Merry Christmas Eve. Can't sleep, she replied a few minutes later with heart emojis and told me to call if I needed anything. I didn't mention the knocking. It felt silly, like admitting it would make me sound paranoid. At 11:03 p.m., the knock came again. Louder, harder. It made the door vibrate slightly in its frame. I jumped, my heart slamming against my ribs. I grabbed my phone and quietly started recording audio, not even sure why. Just a reflex, a need to have proof. Who is it? I asked, my voice shaking despite my effort. There was a pause. Then a man's voice, low and hoarse, answered from the other side. Open the door. It wasn't a request. I can't, I said. It's late. Another pause. I could hear breathing now. Slow, heavy, too close to the door. I know you are alone, the man said. Every hair on my arm stood up. How do you know that? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer right away. Instead, there was a faint sound, like fabric brushing against the door, followed by a soft tap, as if something had lightly bumped into it. I can hear your TV, he said calmly, and your phone. My hand started to shake so badly I almost dropped it. I'm calling the police, I said. The man laughed quietly. That will take time, he replied. I have time. The knocking stopped. I stood there, frozen, staring at the door, waiting for the handle to turn. It didn't. Minutes passed. 5. 10. At 11:26 p.m., I dared to look through the peephole again. I wish I hadn't. The man was standing inches from the door, his face partially obscured by shadow. He was tall, wearing a dark coat that looked soaked through, water dripping steadily onto the floor. His hair was plastered to his forehead, and his eyes were fixed directly on the peephole, staring back at me. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in short gasps. I covered my mouth, tears spilling down my face. Please, he said softly, his voice muffled through the door. "It's Christmas." I backed away until my shoulders hit the wall. At exactly 12 o'clock a.m., midnight, the knocking started again. This time it didn't stop. He knocked continuously, rhythmically for minutes on end. Not frantic, not angry, just steady, relentless, each knock echoing through the apartment, through my chest, through my thoughts. I called 911, whispering into the phone, trying to explain between sobs. The dispatcher told me officers were on the way, but it could take a while due to holiday staffing. The knocking continued. At 12:18 a.m., the man started talking again. He talked about the cold, about standing outside for so long, about how doors were meant to be opened, about how rude it was to ignore someone on Christmas. At 12:31 a.m., he stopped knocking. Silence fell so suddenly it felt wrong. I listened, barely breathing, every muscle in my body tense. Then came a new sound, scratching, low, slow, right near the bottom of the door, like fingernails dragging gently across the wood. "I can wait," the man whispered. At 12:47 a.m., red and blue lights finally flashed through my front window. I burst into tears of relief as I heard voices in the hallway. The police opened my door a moment later. They searched the building, the street, the surrounding area. They found no one, no wet footprints, no witnesses, no sign that anyone had been standing outside my door at all. They told me it was probably someone intoxicated who left before they arrived. I didn't argue. I was too exhausted. I moved out a week later. But every Christmas Eve since then, right around midnight, I hear knocking in my dreams. Slow, patient, familiar. And sometimes when I wake up, I swear I can still smell wet wool by my door, like someone is standing just on the other side, waiting for me to finally let them in.